When I start shooting, all y'all gonna clear out.
On Twitter today, we had a little bit of a backlash from the players once again for Tekken 8. It seems like a common trend, but this time, I mean, are they right? Are they wrong? I mean, truly only time will tell. But really what the issue is here is that the players are not liking that the developers are using the word buff. The players are angry that the developers are talking about buffing characters, meanwhile the whole game is riddled with super powered godlike characters. The saying that's been going around is when everyone's broken, no one is broken. But even with that being the case, players still find a way to put a tier list together and organize the tops from the bottoms, the greats from the worst, and then decide which characters should be nerfed and buffed. I feel like that whole pattern is what got us into this situation, but let's focus. Before the patch notes dropped, they gave us a dedicated policy for season 2, and it listed out 2 updates. One update which is already out, and that update is kind of getting the backlash of its own. I'll talk about that in a future video. But then the second thing was the update that's going to be happening in July with Fakamram. The thing that players are latching onto is the part here where it says 1. Buffs for selected characters within a range that does not significantly impact overall balance. So people don't like the word buff. This game is too powerful, it's too aggressive, and no one really should be buffed. Now what I will say is that there is characters who have problems, and those problems needs to be addressed. Issues where things isn't landing properly. We saw in the update that they just did, Lee has a lot of those things fixed, but I saw Fighting Jim talking about how it wasn't even enough, and he really doesn't even move that well on the tier list. Now, do we want him to move up the tier list? Do we want the other characters to move down the tier list? Once again, that's a different conversation. But what I did notice is, as a side note to all of this, is the type of language that the developers use when talking about how they want to shape this game. For example, when the developers are nerfing characters, they never actually say the word nerf. They always say things along the lines of adjusting or tweaking, tuning, balancing. They say all of these other words instead of just saying nerf. And the reason why they do that is because this is like a game developer tactic. You don't really want to talk about how your game is getting weaker or worse, even though fighting game players love that. Generally in video games, people don't like when their characters are less effective, so they try to not emphasize that as much when marketing and when just talking about the game. But one could argue marketing Tekken 8 as a weaker version of itself would be good marketing. But to contrast that, they do say the word buff, as you see here. They say buff this, buff that, we buffed this, made this stronger, and they don't really hold back on that word. And simply putting it into this environment of season 2, I mean, you can see the backlash that it's creating. For example, you have a tweet here from Speedkicks where he says, slight nerfs to heat and rage arts, slight buff to characters. God, I cannot wait for Elena. Blackheart says, don't buff anyone anymore, for God's sakes. Again, buffs. Season 2 was not enough. Do not buff characters anymore. I hope I read this wrong, but slight buffs for characters in the July patch is something I think we shouldn't even be considering right now. Please, Harada, Michael Murray, and Akatsu, I'll wait for the patch, but make sure they are slight buffs. The game needs to be toned down. Something you could talk about for this update, and we'll get to it in a future video, but just to touch on it a little bit, is how this update didn't do enough. Players are tired of waiting and they want to play the game now, but the game is in an unplayable state, and the devs aren't really like nerfing anything. They're not really making meaningful changes to the balancing of this game. They introduced multiple emergency patches, but these are all slap on the wrist in comparison to what is really being thrown out there. Like when you talk about the new moves that were given and how powerful these new moves are, some of these new moves are operating as if it's still day 1 season 2, and players don't like it, especially when you're throwing around the idea of slightly buffing specific characters, whatever. Players are like, come on, devs, get serious. Another tweet here is quoting the developers, and then it says, who is considered weak right now? I'm scared. And this is the point that I try to tackle as well, because even if you do, follow the road of Devil Chin, pro players absolutely despise Devil Chin. Kudons dropped him. All of the pro players on Twitter who play Devil Chin, they all have been raging as some of them switched to Heihachi and many other characters. But here's the thing. When you look at Devil Chin's online win rates, he is top 10 most effective, deadliest thing in all of Tekken 8. So the developers are in this weird dilemma. Do they buff Devil Jin to make him more tournament viable, or do they say no, he is already online viable enough and we want this character to be an online character and not a tournament character? I feel like that kind of answer from the developers could help. Maybe it would make players more frustrated, but it kind of brings us back to the situation that once happened in Tekken 7 where you had Gigas, an online character, Lucky Chloe, Eddie. You had a lot of characters who were very effective in online but were not good at all in tournaments. And yes, you had some people want those characters to be effective in tournaments, but a lot of people understood that those characters were for online. Now, the interesting thing is that in Tekken 7, Devil Jin was a tournament character who didn't perform so well in online, and now the roles are reversed, and that could be speaking to the outcry that we're seeing related to that character. King J says, man, Tekken, you really ain't reading the room. The game needs nothing but nerfs and adjustments. Forget about buffs. Work on nerfs across the board. Don't know how much direct and blunt I got to say this, man. And this is the thing. When you talk about the developers asking for criticism, asking for feedback, I mean, we will see when the update actually do drop. But it seems like they're once again ignoring the players who have been consistently asking for nerfs. So it is something to be aware of, but also let's not get too ahead of ourselves with the hating on Tekken 8, because as this person says, some people react to the word buff like a bull reacts to the color red. Relax is what they say. Now, I do get why players are very rowdy about the usage of the word buff. When I initially read it, I assumed that the developers were going to be, acting smartly, wisely when implementing those buffs. They will be giving those buffs to the characters who do need it in the specific situations where they do need it, and they will not be getting willy-nilly with the whole concept of it. If they do go that route, and also keep in mind 2.03 will be the final update for a while before I assume like Armor King or something happens. But if they do decide to buff characters and then are done balancing the game, I would imagine that would impact the game very negatively once more. I do think it's interesting as well how in this balance adjustment policy 2.03 is how it's very vague. In the above section, they gave a lot of details, they gave a clear understanding, but in the 2.03, I understand they may not want to like commit to an idea that isn't fully fleshed out yet, but throwing these half-baked ideas out there is causing a type of reverse effect where players are getting confused and they're panicking. We already talked about the buffs and the people who are overreacting, but then also when you talk about the number 2 bullet point of how they say they want to revise frame advantage on block for rage arts, there are some people who are still questioning what this even means. Are they in fact saying that they're going to nerf rage arts and make it more punishable so that the entire roster can do it? Or is this saying something else? I think the developers, when they're talking about future updates, if they want to give information, they have to commit to that idea and give information, because this half give information but not be too specific is causing confusion in an era where we don't need confusion. I liked it better when they said that we have a future update coming. The update is also going to focus on defense, and they left it at that. But doing this update now and then giving this vague, like kind of whatever statement about the next one, it causes not only confusion about what they're doing in the current update, but confusion about what they're going to do then.